2. Flight and Failure. Luther had not come to St. Louis by the paths most traveled. The military revenants clinging on to the hope that lead or explosives could solve the problem posed by the storm meant the roads west across the big river were guarded. People who fled from the depths of the storm were not quite right, it was said, something Luther had seen plenty of evidence for during his flight from the leading edge of the downpour. Perhaps, then, the military were justified in turning back or shooting those who fled into their perimeter around the storm front. That justification didn't change the fact that Luther had needed to slip past them, and that need had forced him to entertain desperation he wouldn't have guessed himself capable of a few months prior. Before the storm, he supposed he wouldn't have been capable of it. Now everything was different. Desperate was now the default state of man. Thus, he had fled the outskirts of Chicago a week ago in a car which he'd had to abandon ahead of the first military checkpoint. He'd hiked an 8-mile loop through farmland in the dead of night to get into the territory beyond the cordons unnoticed, a shaky expedition fraught with near failures. He'd then stolen an old car from a derelict farmhouse to cover the rest of the distance between him and the gateway city. It hadn't been as simple as driving, of course. Gas was too expensive to buy, and even then it was nigh impossible to find it being sold. He'd had to siphon gas from cars he found along the way, in lots or driveways or along the roadside, often being run off in the midst of his theft by equally desperate owners, looking to protect what little they had. Large spans of stalled cars and traffic backups made backroads a necessity, and these posed their own dangers as locals made frantic by the closing clouds tried to deter untrustworthy outsiders and commandeer working vehicles for escape. Police had largely ceased their operations, but that was small consolation, as for every bit of brazen courage it granted Luther, it also saddled him with an equal measure of paranoia. He'd had to ditch his first lifted car after spotting a roadblock by unmarked vehicles ahead of him down a country lane, and after being chased through a forest into a neighborhood in which he'd stolen a bicycle. He'd only narrowly escaped capture. He was unarmed save for a pathetically small revolver he had lifted from the glove compartment of his stolen wheels, and there would be no authorities to come to his aid if he was captured on the road. For the first time in his life, shaky as he was, Luther had to make it solely by his own power in an environment where failure might well mean death. It was by his own power that he'd held a couple at gunpoint for their idling SUV on an interstate on-ramp, and by his own power that he'd driven that sturdy chariot over dirt lanes and winding old asphalt to the edge of the Mississippi, about 12 miles north of St. Louis. There, seen by none save the waning moon, he'd abandoned it and swam the width of the river. Only after he'd shaken himself dry and hiked a few miles toward the distant lights of the city had he found a bike astride a rusting chain-link fence, and picked up the pace once again. All of it had felt unnatural, like a film viewed through a foggy glass. Not things that the Luther of before would have done. Not things that he could have done. Now, dawn had broken, and afternoon had seen him cycling breathless around the aging quarters of the old city in search of his childhood home. It had been nearly 2 decades since Luther had seen it, for he had not left on good terms with his strange and frigid father. His brother was almost more alien than their father had been, equally devoted to long-dead ideas and even more fanatical in his distaste for the world around them. Still, after a year's failures and social explosions, they were all he had. The divorce, the drinking, the fallout with his employer, the splitting of the friends he'd gathered there. All of that ensured he was alone before the coming of the long dark promised by the storm. For whatever reason, his estranged family weighed heavily on his mind as of late. Though it was surely desperation that drove him, Luther meant to find them before the storm closed in on the silent city. The vacant shells lining Thomas Street were almost unrecognizable to him. The better part of 20 years had been cold and cruel to the residents of this quarter of the city, it seemed, for there were empty lots and overgrown yards flecked here and there down the way like teeth knocked from a tired grin. But the ragged old townhouse was there, the exhausted roof of its front porch hanging at an awkward angle, and the sparse pavement of its driveway so eaten through with weeds it could have been mistaken for gravel. The used Nissan his father had picked up for less than $1,099 was still there, Luther saw, missing a rearview mirror and most of its paint. He'd be amazed if the thing still ran. Several other cars, all new to him, were lined up in the driveway behind it. Another sat parked along the roadside in front of the property. A couple looked fairly new, far too expensive and flashy to belong to his family. He'd just begun to think the place might have changed hands when, as he climbed the walk to the front door, it swung open and a huge stranger stepped out to meet him. "Who are you?" The man in the doorway was broad and towering, wreathed in a jacket too heavy for the season and jingling with pendants and jewelry that made him look like a shady medieval merchant. He was shabby, bearded, his face dour amidst a forest of wild red hair. He was unfamiliar to Luther, but at the same time he was exactly the sort of company he'd expect his family to keep. "I'm Enoch's son," Luther answered, drawing back down to the walk as the man stepped out onto the porch and looked him over. "Grew up here." "There's no Enoch here," the man said, eyes narrowed. "Well, maybe he's gone," Luther replied, raising his hands almost as if in surrender, trying to sweep away a bit of the tension. "The old car is still over there in the driveway, though. I grew up here. Been a good few years since I came back." "Well, there's no Enoch here," the big man repeated. "Get off the walk. Now's not a time to be knocking doors." "Enoch?" This voice was different, shaky with the hoarse strain of a lifetime's smoking, rasping with the onset of old age. Luther would have expected someone ancient, but the figure who pushed out past the looming guardian on the porch was perhaps 55. He didn't hobble. His posture was almost regal. Despite being a slight and slender figure, his bearing lent him a gravitas that his awkward dress and unkempt dark hair couldn't diminish. "You said Enoch, yes?" "I did," Luther replied, nodding. "My father." "Enoch is dead," the older man told him. "For about 12 years now. You must be Luther. I didn't recognize you. It's been a long, long time." "I am," Luther said. "Do I know you?" "Perhaps," came the rasp in reply. "I was among your father's brotherhood. I seldom spent time around the house, though. That's a recent development. The storm's seen to that." Luther watched as the older man looked off towards the eastern sky. There wasn't much visible save the clustered skyline of the riverfront. Still, the shade which ate the sky beyond loomed black between the buildings, yawning wide like a mouth seeking meals. They all turned that way a moment, silent and still. For nearly half a minute, seconds slid on by like that, each man privately reckoning how much time lay between them and the storm. It was footsteps climbing the walk to the porch that broke the silence. Luther had only a moment to turn around and see the newcomer before they spoke. "What are you doing here?" The figure he saw behind him was so tall and lean that Luther recognized him immediately. Had it not been for his stature, it would have proven difficult. The man's eyes were sunken and sleepless, his pupils wide with an almost manic energy. He was pale beyond even their family's trademark pallor, with long and matted hair which swathed most of his face as it rustled in the threatening wind. The suspicious glare he gave Luther was enough to make him second-guess his decision to come at all. "I had to leave Chicago," Luther said after a long and uncomfortable pause. "I didn't know where else to go." The response seemed weak in the face of the three men staring him down. Luther hadn't known what else to say, though, lost in the insanity of the situation. He'd never have believed it was possible that he'd be here ever again. Yet here he stood. Aram's eyes shifted up and down, grim and distant, drinking in the details of his brother's shaken appearance. For once, Luther thought, he probably looked more unkempt than Aram. Should I search him? The question came from the huge man on the porch at Luther's back, but Aram was shaking his head before the man finished the question. No, Sariah, Aram said. The dreamer only twists powerful, ambitious minds. Minds with a need for heightened experiences and sensations. The ones with the spark of the primal still hot in their chests. Men who would have been conquerors or raiders or corsairs or explorers in brighter ages when the shackles of civilization weren't quite so heavy. My brother here worked 50-hour weeks as a paralegal in Chicago for a decade sifting emails and papers. He'll never hear the dreamer's call. The older guardian on the porch actually snickered at this, a noise which was more a wheeze than a laugh. Aram hadn't even meant it as a challenge or jibe, though. Luther saw he'd delivered the blunt pronouncement almost the way a doctor would deliver news about infertility. He was so wrapped up in the dispassionate disinterest of the words that it took him a long moment to even question what the dreamer's call meant. But by then the conversation was moving on, leaving him to wonder in silence on his own. Aram's attention turned fully to the porch as he asked, "We've been contacted, I assume?" "Yes and no," the looming Sariah answered. "There was some noise over the radio, an attempt to get through, but I couldn't make anything out. I figured you'd want to be here if any message came in." Aram nodded. He sighed, his eyes flitting a final time towards the darkening sky across town. Luther shifted from foot to foot, nervous yet glad the piercing eyes of his estranged sibling were no longer fixed on him. "All right, Sariah, get back in and keep tabs on the radio," Aram finally ordered. Turning to the older man, he added, "Morgan, I want you back on the maps. I don't care how many routes you've picked or roads you've considered. Add more to the list. Plot every possibility. We have no way of knowing what we'll run into out there, and we must prepare for every eventuality." Both of them nodded, gestures so deep they might well have passed as bows, and strode back through the open door. Odd and off-putting as the pair had been, Luther almost lamented their departure, for it left him alone with Aram. He turned back toward his brother, sheepish, not wishing to look him in the eye again. Though Luther was the older of the pair, though he liked to tell himself that Aram had been swept up in their father's lunatic pursuits and wasted his life, Luther had never felt like the elder brother. The sharp, perceptive intensity in Aram had only been matched by that of their father. Much as it had comforted Luther at a distance to tell himself he'd come out on top in life after his escape from the strange house in whose shadow they now stood, he couldn't believe that any more, especially not after the jolting flight from all he knew and owned. It was Aram who had a small host of loyal men at his call, mad as they all might be. There was certainty in them, even if Luther could never share it. What did he have save wasted years and shadowed memories of better times, besides money tallied up as digits in a banking system which would probably never work again? Nothing. "You've got a revolver in your pocket there," Aram said, his voice almost making Luther jump. "You're lucky Sariah didn't see it. He's still jumpy. He might have shot you if he'd spotted it." "I do," Luther acknowledged, awkwardly patting the oblong outline in his muddied khakis. Though it was Aram, a grown man garbed in gaudy blacks and studs like an edgy teenager about to shoot up a school, who stood opposite him, Luther felt naked by comparison. He was wearing a mangled collared shirt and moderately dressy shoes which had seen better days, like his arduous flight had begun in the middle of a family brunch. In the unpredictable world which was fast taking shape around them, Aram was almost well put together by comparison. "You must have been pretty desperate to even take that," Aram continued. "You're not the sort to have owned one before all this started." I was, Luther acknowledged. People have gone wild out there. Me included, I guess. If only, Aurum said. Give it over. I'm sure it was a useful prop on the road, but you and I both know you won't use that. Luther almost protested, but again there was no mockery in Aurum's words. His eyes had ceased to glare, and his expression was softened. Not quite a smile, but as close to one as Luther had seen since they were boys. As long as you're with us, you won't need it. Probably. Luther did as he'd been told, holding the little weapon like a used tissue. Aurum was right, of course. It had always felt heavy and unnatural in his hand. Even if he'd been truly accosted on the long way to St. Louis, he doubted he'd have been able to make himself pull the trigger. Now, come inside, Aurum said as he tucked the thing away. We'll be leaving soon. If you're to come with us, you'll probably want to rest for what little time we can spare before heading out. You're exhausted, that much I can see. Luther followed his brother up the stairway, leaving his commandeered bike to fall into the dry grass as he asked, You're headed west? Not quite. They pushed into the low-ceilinged front room, Aurum crossing to a table against the wall that hosted ham radio equipment, over which the big man he'd called Soraya leaned and listened. Luther saw that the old couch and the ancient television which had graced the room in his day were still here, and went to sit on the ratty piece of furniture after closing the squealing door behind him. Untidy as their father had been, Aurum remained. The corners were caked with dust, and the wallpaper sheeted from the walls in several places. Luther had just enough time to consider asking what Aurum had meant by not quite when the radio burst into life and drove all in the room to anxious silence. Luther didn't know anything about radio equipment. What he did know was that nothing of the sort had been functioning properly after the advent of the storm, even in places the front hadn't yet reached. The North American continent had been muted, some ripple effect of the freak weather event, Luther supposed. Sparse as authorities had been about the unfolding disaster, that was about as good an answer as he'd been able to muster. Yet here, in this strange house, amidst these strange people, the old set blared and rumbled with a white noise which didn't seem normal. Eidolon, this is the Western Brotherhood. Aurum called out to the static with his fist clenched against the tabletop, his eyes boring into the wall behind the radio setup as if he'd see a face there. Eidolon, this is Aurum. Can you hear me? The garbled, grumbling static dragged on a long moment before a voice, distorted and strange, flared in answer. Eidolon is dead, fallen into the dream, had to be killed. All the others are gone. I'm Malorn, all that's left. It's just me and the outsider we brought with us now. Not certain where to go. Aurum stayed silent, as did all the others in the room. Luther didn't fully understand what was happening, but he felt as if he were suddenly party to something he shouldn't be hearing. He didn't like the feeling. We're lost. No path to the mouth. You were right. Your father was right. Even with everyone we could muster, there weren't enough. The enemy is too many, too strong, too prepared. We are coming, Aurum broke in, his voice iron. The wavering tone on the other end trailed off as Aurum ordered. We have a plan. You are the Eastern Brotherhood now. Your work is not done. You and the outsider find a place near the mouth to hide if you can. Don't try to find Hatfield on your own, not in the middle of all this. Just hole up, don't draw attention to yourselves, and wait for us. Understood, returned the voice. We will try. Things are... The sentence trailed off into surreal static. Aurum drew low over the table, tensed, waiting, but nothing else came. He called Malorn's name, if that's what the strange title was, a few times, but no answer was given. Aurum straightened, waving Soraya and Morgan into action. The big man hopped to his feet and disappeared into the hall while Morgan slipped back out the front door, making for a large SUV parked at the end of the drive. Soraya returned a moment later with bags, clothing, and rifles slung over shoulders and pinned under arms, following his older comrade out to the driveway. They bustled on like that a while, Morgan preparing the vehicle and Soraya loading it, while Aram sprinted down the rickety stairs to the basement, the clamor shaking the tottering old house as he went. Luther watched, more than a bit confused, as Aram emerged with an overstuffed duffel of his own. He was stuffing mounded papers and several battered books inside as he went, pausing only a moment to shout the name "Sias" at the top of his lungs before tucking out through the front door and making for the vehicle. Weighty boots sounded on the staircase which ended the hall, and before long a stern-looking little man with a sturdy build and a sawed-off shotgun wheeled into the front room at speed. He paused only a moment to glance Luther's way before, seeing Aram and the others at work outside, he pushed unceremoniously past and out into the gathering shadows on the wilted lawn. For a long moment, Luther imagined his presence had been forgotten. But, before he could muster up the courage to step out and ask his brother where the group was headed, Aram returned, eyes wide. It wasn't an expression of strained surprise, however, for the longer Luther stared back at his winded brother, the more evident his excitement became. Aram was positively manic, his eyes those of an explorer who's glimpsed gold through strangling jungle leaves. "We are going. You may come or you may stay. I do not think you'll find yourself fortunate enough to continue escaping death should you remain alone. That said, you won't be much safer where we are going. We know much, but not nearly enough. More than you, and more than most, but still not enough. The choice is yours." Where? Aram didn't need further elaboration. Before Luther had even finished the word, he was gesturing with tapering fingers to the eastern horizon through the door. It was grim, blacker than an oceanic storm and gnawing through what daylight remained over St. Louis. "We're going in. We're going to stop what's happening." Possibilities were innumerable. Luther considered protesting the decision, considered appealing to rationalism. He considered asking just how Aram knew what was happening when the world around him was mad to find out, and felt the frustration of long-buried years well up in him. How like their paradoxically thuggish and bookish father Aram was, a sage from some long-lost esoteric library in an outdated punk get-up which made him look as if he might have just robbed a liquor store. Staring into those cold, wide eyes, Luther could almost see their father's strange fire rekindled in them. He'd always taken that burning passion for old, dusty books of arcana and lore to be madness, but holding Aram's gaze made him more and more certain that his brother believed every word of it. He truly believed he was about to stop what no one had been able to stop. The sheer hubris of it should have floored him, but Luther found it almost infectious. After long days on the run, never sure of his next step and never certain of his safety, it shored some desperate part of his soul up to see someone so electrified with poise and purpose in the face of disaster. The silence dragged a long moment, Luther trying to uncover his memories and Aram watching unblinking as his older brother pondered, as if the pressure would hurry him up. "We cannot wait long." Luther blinked, glacial and slow, undecided up until the words finally tumbled from his mouth. Almost, he had time to think, by accident. "I'll go."